Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Stimson Center. Thank you for joining us for this latest edition of the Chairman's Forum. And please join me in welcoming our special guest, Congressman Adam Smith of Washington. Yeah, that's a big one. At the outset, I'd like to express Stimson's great appreciation to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation for their great support to the Chairman's Forum series. We have done a lot of work with the Peterson Foundation, and we value our relationship with them quite a bit. Let me just say a word about our special guests. We have a full house today, many scholars, we have correspondents, we have members of embassies. We welcome you here, foreign embassies, NGOs. It's good to have you all here, and there will be time for questions from you. But before we begin, let me just welcome our guest. Congressman Adam Smith was raised in SeaTac, Washington, graduated from Fordham University, received a law degree from the University of Washington School of Law, later worked in private practice and then as a prosecutor for the city of Seattle from 1993 to 95, went on to work as a judge pro tempore, became a state senator in January 1991 at the age of 25, the youngest state senator in the country. Now in his 10th term in Congress, Representative Smith is the ranking member of the House Armed Services Committee. He's been on the committee since 1997, a very strong advocate for our military personnel and their families. Previously has served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and has supported efforts to reform American foreign assistance, introduced legislation to address global poverty, created the bipartisan Congressional Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance with Congressman Andrew Crenshaw, and Congressman Smith's family lives in Bellevue, Washington. So someone with a lifelong record of both local, community, and now national public service. So we're welcome. It's good to have you here.
Be here. Thank you.
Now, as you know, defense budget issues and defense authorization issues are very much in the news. Secretary of Defense and the Chairman are on the Hill with the Senate today. We heard in the media that Secretary Carter was, and I don't want to be a current news person. I'm not a media guy, but was hoping for a compromise to enable a budget before the end of the fiscal year. This morning, I heard him saying at least by November. Can I just ask you, what's your outlook on this defense budget battle that's going on, this crunch as we run out of the fiscal year?
Yeah, it's not good. And I mean, there are sort of two driving forces behind the problem that sort of get lost in a lot of the noise. You know, whether you're talking about the defense budget or the transportation budget or NIH or any place in the federal government, it seems, you know, you can go chapter and verse on all the shortfalls, on where there's more resources needed and where, you know, there's unpredictability in budgeting and there's all kinds of problems. And then what we run into is after 2010, when the Republicans swept Congress, this is sort of the second thing that happened. I'll get back to the first thing in a minute. You know, we elected a bunch of people who basically don't think the government should spend money, period. Now that occasionally conflicts with programs that they claim they support, but when it comes to actually passing appropriations bills, ideologically, they'd just as soon not. In fact, that's the battle that we have right now, is they want a 6-month CR because they don't want appropriations bills. As crazy as that would have sounded 20 years ago when I first came to Congress, that's where we're at. So you have to contend with that group of people in the House Republican caucus who never want to pass an appropriations bill. And that's led to 6 years of one government shutdown. I lost track at this point, 5 or 6 threatened government shutdowns, countless CRs. And what that means, and I'll just take it back to the defense world, I remember sitting down with then Vice Chief of Staff Corelli for the Army right before April of 2011, when the first threatened government shutdown was about to happen. And he basically said, you know, we've got 220 different programs, and he spends most of his day with his lawyers trying to figure out what they can spend money on and what they can't spend money on. And that continues, because when you get a continuing resolution, you don't know. And lawyers come up with bizarre ways of interpreting it. I remember there was one year when the Senate came up with an omnibus deal. I think this was 2008 or 2009 or something. And the second it got sent up, it got shot down. But they were still able to spend some money based on something that was in that deal that never actually happened, because it showed some sort of congressional intent So it's chaos. I mean, you don't know what you can spend money on. And then the second thing, which preceded all of this, is for reasons that I won't get into because I've already given too long of an answer here. The American public has a very clear consensus on what they want out of their government and out of their members of Congress. They want a balanced budget now. They don't want any taxes increased, and they don't want any programs cut. So basically, my job is to make 2 + 2 = 10, and if I can't do it, I'm a moron. So therefore, whenever a budget comes up, as a member of Congress, you're basically screwed because no matter how you vote, you are going to violate 1, 2, or probably 3 of those things. You're not going to balance the budget. You may raise revenue, and you may cut some program. Now, I will say that elected officials who have been running for office promising to balance the budget without raising taxes or cutting entitlements, have a lot to do with why the American public has come to feel this way. But that's what we run into. I always used to refer to it as 10 pounds of manure in a 5-pound bag. Most people don't like that analogy. I don't know, it amused me, but every crowd I've tried to sort of looks at me and goes, okay, but the point is, there is far more demand for resources than there is willingness to provide them. And therefore, we are constantly locked in these sorts of struggles. And I don't see how we resolve it other than to continue stumbling forward from one CR to the next, maybe getting a few appropriations bills, if everyone's in the absolute right mood. But it is a terrible way to run a government, and it is more destructive to the Defense Department than if you were to just cut their budget 10% and tell them what it was going to be.
Well, the sequestration threat does sort of do an across-the-board cut. I guess as someone who's been in the executive branch off and on for many years, I share your view about how much process gets generated when the Pentagon gets put in a box like that. In other words, there is overseas contingency operations funding. I think Speaker Ryan has talked about perhaps using some of that to cover shortfalls on the base budget, and then it would run out in April, and our operations in the field would have to be subject to a new legislative deadline.
Another cliff, if you will.
And so you do have people trying to figure out what they can and cannot do under existing authority, and which flavor of money they can, and you start procuring systems out of contingency O&M.
Yeah.
Is there a better way to run that railroad?
Oh God, yes. It's really rather simple. You decide how much money you're willing to spend, how much debt you're willing to take on, what revenue you're prepared to raise, and you make rational decisions. That would be the better way to do it. But that's not the American
There seem to be
way.
two sort of philosophical poles. On one side, you had until 2002 the pay-as-you-go law, so that if you were going to spend more money, it had to come out of something else.
Right.
And now there seems to be sort of one school that would like to spend more on defense, but not on anything else, and another school that says for every dollar you spend on defense, we need to spend on other domestic and non-defense priorities.
Right.
How do you resolve that, or how do you approach that?
Well, you don't resolve it when you've got divided government, and unless, even if you have, you've got to get 60 votes in the Senate, so even if you control the Senate, you don't really control the Senate. So you don't really resolve that, and also there's an inherent contradiction even within both parties. So even if either party were to seize complete control and be able to do it, how would they handle that, no cuts, no taxes, balance the budget thing? Not very well is my suspicion. We sort of have to start having a more honest conversation with the American people, and keep in mind, this is all against the backdrop of a $19 trillion debt and a deficit that's back to going up again. It's about $600 billion. Now, we've been lucky for a variety of different reasons. It's never been cheaper to borrow money. How long is that going to last? What would happen if all of a sudden we had to start paying 4% and 5% for the money that we were borrowing? We'd be in a whole world of hurt. So, rationalizing this budget again, and I will say for my part, I think revenue is a huge part of this. We have cut taxes by $7-8 trillion in the last 15 years. depending on how you calculate it. Meanwhile, complaining all along the way about all the areas where we don't spend enough money, like defense. This is the argument I get in with my Republican colleagues who get all outraged that we're not spending enough money on defense, but absolutely refuse to put revenue on the table. So, I mean, look, there's a better, more rational way to do it, but there doesn't seem to be the inclination, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
It's curious to me that I guess I'm curious about how much does the strategic situation in the world factor into this conversation with your colleagues? And the point being that if you think the world is about the same in 2017 as it was in 2013, then a CR doesn't seem to make that much difference. But if you think that there are some new concerns,
right there, it always makes a difference if you're doing a CR. It always screws up the way you're running government, regardless of what you're trying to do. But
and so I've heard, for example, at West Point, exams have been given saying you have less resources than you thought you had. What's your strategy? And the sort of historic military thinking is it's when times are lean that you make strategic prioritization, you make choices. So is there, I guess I want to ask you about the kind of the basic trade-offs, leaving aside the scene that you have set, between...
I wish I could, but yes.
Yeah, but between sort of force levels, amounts, combat platforms, sort of the static numbers of the size of the force versus readiness, which Secretary Carter said yesterday, sending troops into combat ready is his top priority.
Yep.
We had actually the chief of the Air Force a few years ago, General Nordy Schwartz, who made news by saying, if you're going to cut my budget, cut my manpower, don't give me a hollow force.
Exactly.
And so philosophically, how do you approach the trade-off between size of the force, readiness of the force, and investments in all of the personnel and R&D and things like that?
Well, first, I agree profoundly with the point that you just made, that if we say, well, you have to have an Army that's 490,000 strong, you have to buy the A-10, you can't lay up these 11 cruisers that you want. If you build in all of these costs and then you don't have the money to train the force, that is the worst thing that we can do. Whatever the mission is, we need to make sure that we have the men, women, and equipment trained to perform that. I think that's very important. Two other points. And this is the argument you will hear with great frequency. My goodness, the world is so much more complex, so much more dangerous. We obviously have to spend more money on defense. And I don't disagree, by the way, with the first part of that. When you look at the world today, you've got certainly the threat from Al-Qaeda and Daesh and other violent Islamist extremist groups that are spreading and are a grave threat to be confronted, which cost a great deal of money in a variety of different ways. You've got Putin, who's trying to restart the Cold War, who can't be ignored, because if you embolden him, it gets worse. You've got North Korea, enough said. We've got our complicated relationship with Iran going forward. I worry less about China than most people, just because those other things that I said are so much more scary than China if you look at it in comparison. But you still got China, making land grabs or water grabs, if you will, in the South China Sea. And that's a pretty complex threat environment, no question. But you leap right away to saying, okay, we have to spend more money on defense to deal with this. I would disagree with that somewhat, because first of all, the way we do it in the military world, and you know this, is you come up with a scenario. If Putin goes into Estonia, what would we need? If North Korea, rolls into South Korea, what would we need? If China starts a war with you, you can spin out any scenario you want. And the thing is, if you spin out those scenarios, we could have a $2 trillion defense budget, and we still wouldn't be ready. Because there's an endless array of possibilities. So obviously that's not rational. What you have to do, as they all like to say at the Pentagon, is manage risk. And I think we can do a better job of managing that risk without necessarily spending more money. It's the one thing Republicans are always willing to throw money at, is the Department of Defense. Everything else, education, healthcare, all those others, you can't just throw money at the problem. DOD, you can throw money at it. I think there's smarter ways to do it.
Let me pick up on that thread, which is to say, I'll just make a comment that at the height of the nuclear age, the real focus amongst civilian security experts was avoiding the escalation of small wars into something less controllable that could escalate to the nuclear brink between the two superpowers.
Yeah.
So conflict resolution was a massively important intellectual industry.
That's another piece of the puzzle.
And so my question is, you've described something, and this is my take, that sounds like you're playing goalie already. By the time the North invades the South, by the time Putin goes into Estonia, you know, the goal has already been fired. You're the goalie. You have to block the goal. That's the last ditch, you know, resort. You haven't done anything.
What was going to be my second point?
What was that? Okay. I really wanted to, if I may, just Congressman, ask you about the other tools of the national kit.
That's
we used
where
to be,
I'm going.
the word that I like is clever, because it's disappeared from the lexicon of people in my world. We're not very clever anymore, and I say that in a completely bipartisan way, or nonpartisan. We don't figure out ways to influence bad actors short of shooting at them.
Okay. No,
So I want to sort of provoke you with that and see.
Taught a class of this at the University.
I know
of
you
Washington
support
years
other
ago.
tools of influence.
You know, it's defense, diplomacy, development. You know, the 3 Ds of how you sort of manage the global scene. And if you're doing it right, you manage it so it doesn't spin out of control. You know, you work with a place like Mali or Somalia or Yemen or some of these other places to stop them from falling completely apart. You invest in diplomacy and you invest in development. And, you know, this is basic counterinsurgency, which, by the way, counterinsurgency got a horrible name because of Iraq and Afghanistan. Counterinsurgency does not have to be on that scale. And on that scale, it doesn't work. Most of the time, it's much, much smaller. It's working in small countries to try to build a more stable place. But you've got to use all your tools, not just the Defense Department. In some cases, it's the Justice Department, it's the Agriculture Department, it's on and on. But the problem is we underfund those things, and this is an argument we had during negotiations on this year's NDAA. The Department of Defense wants the ability to give money to other departments like USAID or state to fund projects. And we've wrapped ourselves in this tight little circle, which I got in a big argument with a certain senator over, because totally against this plan, said, you know, this is, you know, giving them way too much power. But we have this argument all the time. You know, Secretary Gates was the first one to say, look, the State Department needs more money.
Actually, Rumsfeld gave, when I was an assistant secretary under Powell, Rumsfeld paid a lot of bills, but eventually the Hill was saying, why, you know, you're working with the wrong committees, and those authorities transferred to DOD because they were paying for it.
Yeah, and I mean, the DOD has the money. And,
right.
And then you come back, you know, the same Republicans who say we don't want DOD to give money to all these other people are the same ones that say that only DOD can get an increase. And so DOD, I don't know the numbers, and so this statement might not actually be true, but I'll bet you it's a hell of a lot closer to true than it ought to be. I would bet that the Department of Defense spends more money on what would be classically defined as development than USAID. Because they've got their CERT funds, CERT, something like that.
There's no question.
They got all that stuff, but we won't take the money from DOD and give it to these other agencies. And yeah, I chaired the subcommittee on special ops for our terrorism for 3 years, so I worked very closely with the special operations community, and they were begging for USAID to get more money. You know, and I went and visited them in the Philippines and in parts of Africa and other places where things hadn't gone totally off the rails yet. And that development piece and that diplomacy piece was critical. So I totally agree with you. We don't have enough money to defend ourselves militarily against all these threats. We just don't. It doesn't exist. So we better get, to use your word, more clever about how we interact with the rest of the world. The Iran nuclear deal being, I think, a good example of a way to maybe try to reduce tension instead of trying to provoke another war.
Well, let me just ask you, since you mentioned the Iran deal, leaving aside the nuclear terms, which are being monitored and whatnot, Iran is doing other things which were not part of the negotiation. You know, some say they have 15,000 IRGC and regular army in Syria, 18 bases, etc. Should we have are we allowed to have a separate policy on things that concern us, including their human rights record at home?
If we're smart, I hope we are. Because we take an absolutist approach to, if you're doing anything we don't like, A, we're not going to deal with you, and B, eventually we're going to start shooting at you. We're going to be in a lot of trouble. I think to be clever, as you described, and use the diplomacy, we better be prepared to deal with people who are doing things we don't like. Because if they weren't doing things we wouldn't like, it'd be easy to deal with them. And I don't want to go to war with everybody. And in fact, when you look out at the future and, how do we make all this work? And I've felt this way for a long time. The only way we make all of this work is if we have a multipolar world, which is part of the reason why I found the New American Century document that the neocons cranked out a few years back to be one of the most moronic pieces of defense policy I'd ever seen. And the notion was that America should remain the sole dominant power in the world into the 21st century, and this was in our best interests. I've never disagreed more with the statement. To have all of that responsibility and to have the whole rest of the world sort of angry at you because you think you're in charge of everything is a recipe for disaster. We've got to find a way to work with China. We've got to find a way to work with Russia. And I admit it's not easy. Certainly we need to work with the European Union. And then I very much applaud Ash Carter for what he's doing with India to try to build a better relationship with them. So that when problems like Daesh and Al-Qaeda or climate change or North Korea or Iran pop up, we have allies to work with. This is also part of using smart power, to work with these countries in a multipolar way to try to bring greater peace, stability, and prosperity to the world. That's what I think we need to do.
Okay. Well, I never talk about the neoconservatives with whom I served, but I will just point out that their vision of a unipolar world didn't survive 5 minutes of the tender mercies of their own management of the problem. So
Yes.
I'll just leave it at that.
Yes.
But let me ask you about technology. You've just described the world in very sort of political and sociological terms, which I think is quite appropriate, as well as a longer-term vision of convergence between the populations of the world and hopefully leaders that we can work with. Those are visions that I think should have the basis of broad general support, independent of politics, if I could put it that way.
Okay.
But the Pentagon is talking about technology, the third offset program, in a way that there's nothing wrong with modernization and doing things better and more effectively than the other guy. But to what extent can technology substitute for all of the things of political engagement that animate movements and hostility and conflict in the world? How much can technology do for our national defense?
Well, that's a different question.
Okay, well, you can parse.
Yeah,
choose
the first question is to what can technology do? Technology cannot replace diplomacy. Technology can, and look, despite what the folks at Facebook and other places think, where they think they're going to save the world with their technology, it's a mixed bag. Technology empowers bad people as well as good people in a complicated and difficult way. But technology can certainly save us money defense-wise, if we are smarter about how we use it. If you can get to a quicker solution through innovation, build something cheaper, faster, smarter, then yes, it can be helpful. Of course, part of the problem with technology that has made things so difficult is, and this is one of the, I think, underappreciated problems with some of our larger procurement problems like the F-35 and the Ford Carrier and all of that, is it changes so quickly. You start building something and 6 months later it's like, it's obsolete. Well, we got to change it. And it becomes expensive. How do we manage that in a better way? So on a large scale, it's a problem. On a small scale, and this is what I think, what Ash Carter's doing is really smart, is reaching out to the technology world. And part of that is finding those smaller companies. I do this all the time in my state, in my district. Yes, I've got Boeing and Microsoft, and they said, but some of the best ideas, come from very small companies. But can they find the Pentagon? Can the Pentagon find them? So what Ash is doing by setting up these technology centers, by doing this outreach, you're going to get better, cheaper solutions to problems by better engaging in technology. But overall, technology is a double-edged sword, without question, because of the rapid change and disruption that it brings. You may think you have the best idea, but in the same moment you come up with it, somewhere across the world, somebody's come up with something to defeat it. And that makes it complicated.
Well, let me just ask you about this social media world. Americans are well aware when they turn on their cable news channels that there's trouble not only around the world, but that it's coming inside our borders, and that there's homegrown terrorism, there is extremism that's sort of crossing borders, and it's migrating obviously through social media. Are we postured correctly? And when you look at sort of the Armed Services Committee and Defense Department, then you look at DHS and its oversight, is there anything you would do differently in terms of how we are configured to address these real-time, fast-moving problems?
Actually, yes, I think we are postured correctly, with one exception that I'll note in a moment.
After 9/11, we did one thing that I think was really smart, and it was General McChrystal at the time who said, it takes a network to defeat a network. And so it was the first time we really started to break down some of the walls and started to cooperate. Now, walls still exist, turf still exists, it's still a challenge, but the National Counterterrorism Center, we brought in all these different elements of our intelligence operation. The FBI actually started working with the CIA and working with DOD. And we got a much better idea of who the bad guys were. They'd have a daily brief, which I haven't been in one in a while, but I've been in one when I was in Iraq and Afghanistan and DC, all over the world, where they bring all these people together and they say, okay, what are the bad guys up to today? And keep track of them, and we have, and I think this is underestimated, the success rate we've had at taking out some of these guys. The George W. Bush who said, I'm tired of playing whack-a-mole. And I get that, and I think he's right. But on the other hand, there are some moles that need to be whacked. That's just the nature of the game. And we better be in a position to whack them before they whack us. And I think we've done a reasonably effective job of that. Now, I think we can do a better job of working with local law enforcement. And obviously, you get into a layer of complication, because when I say local law enforcement, the pipe, the graph just went to every city and county, and, all of it. How do you, but we can do that, and we can slowly work better at it. But look, at the end of the day, and Thomas Friedman, most prescient book I've ever read in my life was The Lexus and the Olive Tree, written in 1997. And he predicted a lot of what's happening. The technology, super empowered individuals, that you radicalize people with technology. And I don't mean a comparison here. I'm just saying this is an example of how much the world has changed. When Ron Paul ran for president twice, 20 years apart, nothing much changed about his ideology in between. But in 1988, he was a sideshow. Very few people knew him, whatever, Ron Paul, who was that? 20 years later, he raised $6 million in a day. Why? And what had changed was the internet had enabled him to connect all of the people in the country who felt like he did. And it wasn't that large a number of people, as set against 310 million, but it was enough. And they were able to get organized. Now, taking that down to a different level, radical groups can now use the internet to instantly radicalize people. And the worst part about it is, yes, some of these folks are ideological. You can see them, drifting towards extremism in different ways. A lot of them are just violent, sociopathic losers who decide that this is what their justification is going to be for committing a violent act. How do you find those people before they go off? It's a challenge for law enforcement and for our organization that I think we really need to work harder on.
Well, I think you've also, if I may, just described the same kinds of people all around the world who flocked to Syria. It's the same.
Yep.
And so there are communities everywhere that one could be looking at with a different kind of a strategy to get at the grassroots of that problem.
Well, I remember talking to the head of the NCTC, Mr. Leiter. I have a terrible time with first names, and
there were a couple of major league pitchers named Leiter, and I'm probably going to say one of their names. But anyway, I was talking to him about Abdul Muttalib, the guy, the underwear bomber in Detroit. And, his father had gone to the embassy, I forget where, Nigeria, and warned them, hey, I think my son's gone off the rails. As we went back and pieced back through it, there was all this evidence, and they said, my goodness, how come you didn't find this guy? And I said, well, I guess it's kind of like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And he said, oh, no, it's worse than that. It's like trying to find a needle in a needle stack. Because I could right now show you 10,000 reports on people, and you'd look through each one of them and go, yeah, get that guy. He's crazy. He's obviously crazy. Only most of them might be a little crazy, but they don't ever do anything.
Right.
And you can't pick all of them up. So how do you find the ones who are going to act? And I'm convinced, by the way, that with technology, and I met with different groups, and we did a lot of mapping in Afghanistan and Iraq, where you sort of took the known universe of folks and could predict who was going to go off, who was going to actually be a problem, in a way that, frankly, gave me sort of a futuristic sci-fi freak out. Like, how do you know? But there's ways to program software to spit out these answers.
I'm in the private sector, and I'm aware of at least 3 entities that are big data intensive, data mining, and they make connections that no one else can. I'll just say that, 1983, when the Marines were hit in Beirut, and I was the country director for Lebanon in the Pentagon, they used the needle in the haystack analogy because the one piece of intelligence did exist, but it was among thousands and thousands of pieces of intelligence. It was there. They just they just couldn't find it. So we generate a lot of intelligence. The question is, how do we filter it? But let me ask you about cybersecurity. I have a couple of related questions. I just saw a graph this morning that the number of attacks against databases in the U.S. has gone up exponentially over recent years. Defense Department, it has made a much greater priority about cyber. You obviously received the briefings on it in the committee. My understanding of it dates back to a decade ago when I did international cybersecurity cooperation, and my counterparts and I weren't quite sure what it was, but we had bank VPs and insurance executives and whatnot, railroad people. How important is cyber from a Defense Department standpoint, and how much attention and sort of authority and resources does it merit as among traditional defense functions?
It's enormously important. I don't think we should let it replace some of this other intelligence gathering stuff that I was talking about earlier, but it is very important. It's also very difficult.
Is offensive cyber something that we need to spend a lot on? Is that an important part? We used to deny that we were doing it because the Russians wanted an international ban, and so we denied that we did it. Now it's a different world.
I think, yes, we need to build our capabilities, but I don't have a lot of deeply intelligent things to say about cyber, except to say that it's a constantly changing world. We need very, very smart people to monitor it so that they can constantly change with it to both protect us and put us in a position where necessary to use it as a tool and as a weapon.
Let me switch to drones. The Stimson Center had a task force on drones, co-chaired by General John Abizaid and Rosa Brooks, the Georgetown law professor, with many former officials of different expertise, and they were concerned about the use of. I go back to your whack-a-mole comment that President Obama was relying very heavily on lethal targeting by drone, not only in Iraq and Afghanistan, areas that were sort of understood to be part of the legal battlefield, but in many other countries as well, and at large numbers. And there was a transparency question that the Commission felt that we needed to know more about the legal justification and needed to be reassured that there was oversight before lists were developed and people said, go ahead and whack them. Can you comment on, are you comfortable with the use of, basically with the oversight mechanism and the level of transparency that exists now in the way we conduct lethal operations?
Yes on the first, not so much on the second, though it's difficult. I think there's sufficient oversight. I spent a lot of time with Jay Johnson when he was the Pentagon's lawyer before he was at DHS talking about this issue. And I think they went through a very rigorous process. And, it was a complicated process.
leading right up to the president and the decision making. Transparency is tough because so much of that is, tradecraft. So much of that is, secrets we don't want to reveal. And it's happened that, people have found out, well, this is how we determined this was the guy. We used this, this, and this. And then, well, the bad guys found out about it, and they stopped using this, this, and this, and we couldn't find them anymore. So I think the transparency piece in our society is always going to be difficult. What we have to make sure is that we have sufficient oversight. Because I do think, people have, become very critical of the drone program, but, look, you can argue about, are we hitting the right people? By and large, I think we are. And then if you don't want to use drones, would it be better if we sent in, 20 SF guys? Would it be better if we dropped a 500-pound bomb? Drones were actually pretty precise.
And would you do those? Would you do those alternate operations if you didn't have drones? In other words, are you only?
Would you be willing to take that risk?
And if not, what does that say about the decision to use lethal force in a place where you wouldn't risk American life to accomplish that mission?
Yeah.
So all right, let me. I want to give you one. I know there's so many people want to ask you questions. One more, which I think is quite important from your perspective as well, and that is the nuclear fleet, if you will, the nuclear piece of the Defense Department's budget. There are voices that are calling for large investments in modernizing the nuclear triad, the ICBM force. I know that you have a position on that. I want to give you the opportunity to give us your view on where we stand on the future role of nuclear weapons and where that fits in the appropriate investment strategy for the Pentagon.
Yeah, we flat can't afford it. And from a priority standpoint, it's the wrong priority in the world that we face. We need a nuclear deterrent. There's no question about that. But the level, the size, and the cost of a nuclear deterrent, I think, doesn't warrant the threats that we face. Because, one, those threats, you can game out, well, if Russia did this and China did that and North Korea did this and Iran did that, then we'd really like to have 5,000 nuclear warheads. Yeah, well, I think at that point we're pretty much all toast anyway. So we should work hard to make sure that doesn't happen, number one. Number two, a relatively small number of nuclear weapons can be a spectacular deterrent. This is China's philosophy. They don't have anywhere near the number of weapons that we have. What they have is enough to say, don't screw with us or we will obliterate you. I think it kind of works.
I want to give you the opportunity to answer this question. Are you satisfied that the U.S. nuclear sort of umbrella over Japan's security with their Article 9 pacifist constitution is intact and is strong with the current nuclear force?
Right now, yes. I think, look, nuclear weapons pack a pretty substantial punch. I forget the numbers, but Hiroshima and the weapons we have today are thousands of times more powerful than that.
Well, there was a policy doctrine at one time when I was younger that said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. But that didn't mean that we shouldn't have a nuclear deterrent.
Absolutely.
It meant we should solve our problems short of nuclear war.
And have that as a deterrent. And look, this is the answer I gave to North Korea in an interview the other day was, what do you do about North Korea? Look, we can sanction them, that's fine, but they're crazy. They don't care if their people starve. They ain't changing. The only thing we can do about North Korea is make it absolutely clear to them that if they step over the line, we will destroy them. And if they use a nuclear weapon, they're gone. Completely, totally, and utterly, and no ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that's the only rational deterrent that works in that situation. So yes, we'll need it as a deterrent. But we don't need the numbers that we have, because the numbers that we have are only justified by what you just said we shouldn't do, and that's gaming out a way to win a nuclear war. That's the only way you can justify the number of nuclear weapons that we have.
I want to take two very quick hit sort of turf questions just because I'm curious about them. One is the long-term Israel aid agreement that Congress was not involved in. It was between Israel and the administration, where Israel pledged to give back any extra money that Congress appropriates. Did the administration overstep Congress's legitimate role with the power of the purse?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's not something I would put into words in the agreement, because it certainly does have that feel to it. You know, if Congress wants to give more money, it should. I understand why the administration did it. Is, you know, they don't want to be constantly being one up. Look, we're making a deal with you. This is what we're going to give you. If you then come back and use Congress to leverage us, you know, you're undermining the agreement. But I think to explicitly say that Congress can't do that does overstep those bounds. And that probably would have been better served to be sort of a gentleman's agreement, rather than something that was written down as sort of a...
One more, and I'm sorry if it's dirty laundry, but I was invited to testify to the House Foreign Affairs Committee about this legislation on the size of the NSC. And it seemed that 35 members showed up, probably because your bill has language that would limit the NSC to 150, in excess of which the National Security Advisor would have to be Senate confirmed, and NSC staff would be subject to being called before Congress to testify. Is that the province of the Armed Services Committee? I'm just asking as a neutral observer here.
Well, look, I mean, the NDAA gets into all kinds of things that are not the province of the National Security Committee. Can anyone say sage grouse? You know,
I didn't say it.
It's the nature. We have a vehicle that moves, which is a very rare thing.
It is a rare thing.
People try to latch everything onto it. The larger question is the wisdom of that particular provision, and we have made some alterations in it. And it's tough, and I've tried to explain this, and I've argued this to both Senator McCain and Congressman Thornberry and others who are upset about this. What they are upset about is they are upset that the Obama administration has a few people that are close to them that are making a lot of decisions without what they feel is proper deference to the Department of Defense. Okay? And I says, look, yeah, the NSC has grown. The world has grown more complicated. But you could shrink the NSC to 100 and you wouldn't change your concern. In fact, all this is going to do is it's going to create a lot more White House personnel. Okay? Instead, you know, they'll keep the number below so they don't have to confirm the national security. Well, we kind of got rid of that in the conversation. But anyway, they'll adhere to the law. And, you know, then they'll just hire more White House personnel. I mean, the issue is, you know, whether or not a given administration pays proper deference to Congress and to the DOD, and you can't enforce that by law.
Well, if people want to go deeper on that, I can only commend the glittering testimony that I put on the record for the other committee. So,
Right. Yeah.
With that, may I throw you to the wolves? And
Certainly, and I will say, by the way, I missed this one point. It is a dangerous encroachment in presidential prerogative to start messing with the NSC and the executive's right to have those people to give them candid advice outside the department. So I think that is a concern as well.
Well, the one sort of bigger thought that I wasn't there to defend the size of the NSC, but just to point out that there are so many new offices that are empowered throughout the State Department and Defense Department and military. There are so many single-issue offices that you could say you need a bigger NSC just to chase down all these bureaucracies, and so sort of 1,000 bowls of rice is the way I look at it.
Yeah.
I would love to see an executive legislative convergence that cuts the number of Senate confirmed positions, consolidates a few oversight mechanisms, limits the number of confirmations, holds, plum book, and all of that. But so that's a bigger question. I'm not sure that I'm overflowing with optimism that the politics will allow something like that. But
It's a complicated world. Arguably, it's a too complicated country to govern, but we do our best.
Thank you. All right, with that, please wait for the microphone, tell us who you are, and speak clearly. In the middle here, sir. First question. Microphone. There we go. It's right there. Yep.
I'm Richard Savoya from the National Foreign Trade Council. I want to commend you on your intelligence and service. With respect to Oblivit, which was what you started with, 10 pounds in a 5-pound bag.
Right.
You threw a word at me that I don't understand, but I know where you're going.
Would
That's right.
reforming the budget process
Yeah.
make any difference? For example, requiring that members have to vote every year on entitlements.
I don't know. That might just make us make it grow even more. I think it would be helpful if we had a 2-year budget and if we had a capital budget. I think those two things would help. But at the end of the day, the problem is the yin and the yang of America. Okay, we are the country that will do anything. You know, walk into any school in this country, and I guarantee you, there's a poster somewhere that says something along the lines, "If you can dream it, you can do it." I've always been that practical. It's like, yeah, no, I don't think so. There are some things you can dream that you cannot do. But the point is, we're aspirational. We believe the impossible can be done. I always liked it when I was in Luxembourg, and in this restaurant, they had the sign over the top of it is, "All we want is what we have." And I said, that's downright un-American. But the point is, you know, that overdriving ambition has, you know, polluted the political mind and the mind of the voters. So we can make all these little changes we want, you know, and I can sit down and rationally explain that you can't have entitlements at this level and taxes at this level and a balanced budget. And people will just go, well, they'll be like my son, who is relentless and demanding. As he said when he was 4 years old, my philosophy is it never hurts to ask. You know, I'll just say, okay, all right, that's interesting, but this is what I want. Okay? I want a balanced budget with ideas. So we got to break through that mindset in the American people. We can change the process, you know, but the mindset is still there. They'll vote out of office the people who changed the process that wound up, you know, cutting something they didn't want cut or raising a tax they didn't want raised. So it's a much deeper problem, I think.
Over here, thank you. The gentleman in the second row, please.
Thank you. John Donnelly with Congressional Quarterly.
Sorry I didn't get out to see you the other day, by the way. You sent
Oh,
a note in, but I was
no problem.
otherwise occupied.
No problem.
But here we are.
On nuclear weapons, specifically, what would you like to cut? And can you give us an update on defense authorization? Is the sage grouse the only issue? And how do you see the end game playing out with the veto looming and not much time in the lame duck?
Yeah, we've done it in December before, so I think we'll do it in December again. I think once the appropriators make their decision, whether it's a CR or some form of appropriation bill, and we get a number, it'll be a lot easier to get it done. As far as the sage grouse, it's the biggest problem remaining. There is one other, but you know, and for whatever reason, the EPA said they're not going to list the darn thing anyway. The promises have been made, you know, on a very high level in the Republican caucus, and I don't know how we get around that, because that would definitely be veto bait. But, you know, I'll remain optimistic that somehow, some way we'll work it out, because we don't have huge differences on some of these other issues. First part, I think the land-based nuclear part of the triad is the one that we can most afford to reduce. I'm very fond of the submarines because they are obviously the most survivable and the most usable. And then overall, I think we, you know, on all three levels of the triad, build fewer nuclear weapons, replace fewer of them. We don't need as many as we are saying we need.
Okay, let's go in the front row here, then I'll come over here. There we go.
Thank you. My name is Avram Raj.
Is that working? Is the mic working?
If you could queue up who's going to be next, so maybe he can get the microphone to
Okay.
that
Hold
person.
it
I got to
close.
go
Okay.
in a couple minutes.
Okay.
Hey.
Hello, my name is Avram Reisman. I work for an organization called Just Foreign Policy. Regarding counterinsurgency in Yemen, on June 16th of this year, you were one of the most prominent of 16 Democrats who voted against an amendment to the NDAA to ban the transfer of cluster bombs to Saudi Arabia, despite evidence of the Saudi-led coalition's deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian structures, including with U.S. bombs. The amendment would have succeeded if 7 members had switched their vote. Do you still believe you voted correctly, and if so, how do you justify your decision?
I do.
There are several larger questions at play here, and one is, do we sell arms to Saudi Arabia? Period. I happen to think that we shouldn't completely cut them off. Certainly what's going on in Yemen is troubling, and I think it's prudent to put a pause button on that. And the second thing is there's this great misunderstanding about cluster bombs, and this was the main reason for my no vote. The cluster bombs in question, and all a cluster bomb by definition is a munition that has more than one, or a bomb that has more than one munition in it. And the ones that we are selling them and are talking about selling them actually have anywhere from 4 to 10 little sort of tuna fish can size things that pop out with a parachute. And if they find heavy armor, they hit it. If they don't, they deactivate. So all the bad things that we've heard about cluster bombs, and there are some very, very bad cluster bombs that just go indiscriminately all over the place, don't detonate, lie on the ground waiting for someone to step on it. What we were talking about selling was vastly safer than a 500-pound bomb, safer than a lot of the things that we were apparently willing to keep selling to Saudi Arabia. So the substance of the issue, I think the amendment was wrong. Now, good luck to me explaining that to people. But I took a substantive vote on the actual facts of the issue as opposed to the emotion behind it. If you want to have a conversation about, how we should better govern what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, yeah, I'm open to that. And I'm open to saying we shouldn't hold off on selling them any weapons for a little while. But understand also that Saudi Arabia has a legitimate interest in not having an Iranian proxy take over Yemen. And so do we. And how do you fight that war? How do you get to a better place? Right now, given the reports, given what we've seen, I think using the diplomatic tool is the better approach. But to permanently ban the ability of our administration to sell to Saudi Arabia a weapon that is, quite frankly, one of the least likely to cause civilian casualties, I didn't think was the right choice.
Let's go over here, please. The gentleman with the mic.
Dan Clay, Green Cross International. Thank you for coming out today, Congressman.
Sure.
I want to ask you again about a sort of a loaded and kind of impossible question. I'm wondering what you think it's going to take for Congress to develop a better working relationship with the Russian Federation, and if you think we're ever going to be able to look at this country as potentially even, understandably things are a bit difficult right now, but do you think this is ever a stage that we'll be able to get to with this nation?
It's possible. Russia wants to be successful. They're not nihilistic or ideological in the way that, say, North Korea or Iran is. They want to be economically successful. They want to be prosperous. And I think we need to keep looking for ways to work with them, even as we confront the challenge that Putin presents. The two things that happen, one, post-Cold War, we did a little bit too much of a victory dance, which, Russia has pride, as well they should, whether it was the expansion of NATO or the placing of weapon systems over there. And, I understand that none of that had anything to do with Russia, but Russia doesn't. And we didn't do a good enough job, I think, of working that and sort of set the stage for Putin. But the second thing is, how can I put this exactly? Russia's a tough country. They have no history whatsoever of effective governance. Their people have never really governed themselves prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They don't have the institutions in place. They don't have the history of rule of law, of basic structures. So they had a hard time being successful, and they turned back to nationalism. And, for lack of a better way to put it, a fascist, to make them feel better about themselves. Now, not all Russians obviously agree with this, and I think it's going to be a post-Putin Russia where we have the opportunity to do that. In the meantime, I think we have to just make sure that the relationship doesn't fray further. And hopefully with a post-Putin Russia, then there will be an opportunity. Because building back on what I had said earlier, Russia is one of the great powers of the world that ought to be part of a multipolar world, trying to deal with the problems we all face.
Time for one or two more?
Two more.
Okay, let's go over here, please. I didn't see hands up while you were speaking, so. And then who's the next one? We'll get this gentleman over here in the back, third row.
Hi, I'm Janelle Hahn. I'm from the Allen Institute, and I was recently in the Air Force. I just got out, and one of the things that I noticed was the biggest issue in the Air Force was the issue that the generals are not willing to bring out to congressmen, and that is, besides the money and technology issues, they're mostly concerned about the culture of bureaucracy. And I know that there's not much Congress can really do, but is there anything that Congress can do to make changes in the human cultural issue?
It's really tough. I mean, the Pentagon is the mother of all bureaucracies. You know, you can try, but I'll tell you what's going to stop you. I mean, the simplest way to change it would be to, you know, reduce the layers of management and give more individual control to program managers and others, and sort of sift through all of that. But that bureaucracy is in place because if a mistake gets made, we all want to be able to say, well, we had a process, you know? Yeah, that person turned out to be corrupt, but we had multiple layers and all this other stuff. We sort of, we've made it very, very hard for people who work at the Pentagon to use their individual initiative to be effective because we've drowned it in process. I think the simplest thing we could do is streamline that, empower program managers and others to make decisions, and then hold them accountable for those decisions. Reward them, punish them, you know, depending on how those decisions go. But right now, it's just layer upon layer upon layer upon layer. I mean, look at the F-35. Who's responsible for the F-35? Everybody, which means nobody is. Because you know, this guy was in charge for a month, but he was only in charge of this piece, and this other person was in charge, and you know, we really need to shrink that down and give people greater responsibility. But I don't see that happening, because like I said, the risk is, well, what if something goes wrong? Then that you created we'll never create a single point of failure, but you only have 8 points of failure instead of 35. If we had 35, this wouldn't have happened. Probably would have happened, and in the meantime, you know, we've wasted all this money on these other 27 points of failure. So that's what ought to happen, but I think it's going to be very difficult to get there.
Okay, final
Yes,
question, sir?
Yes. Kevin Meister from Human Rights First.
Yes.
You mentioned drone strikes and said that you thought they were precise, but do you really think they offer an effective counter-terrorist strategy on the long term, especially when innocent civilians end up being killed sometimes? And also, proposals have come forward on a new authorization for the use of military force. Do you agree that our mission against ISIS necessitates a new piece of legislation that precisely defines our mission, objectives, and the target, as opposed to broad resolutions that date back to 2001 and 2002? Thank you.
And second, yes, in the second question, I mean, we are really stretching the authorizations past the point of rationality. The difficulty, of course, is when you come up with the language on a new AUMF. You know, no matter how you construct it, half the people are going to say it's too broad, and half the people are going to say it's too narrow. But obviously, we are conducting operations in Syria and Iraq that cannot, in any rational way, be tied back to existing authorization, other than the president's inherent Article 2 authority. And you want to get into that argument. So yes, on that. The first. All I'm going to say about drones is they are more precise than any other option that would be on the table. You know, as far as long-term effectiveness of it, look, long-term, and again, I'll quote General McChrystal again, you know, anytime you choose to kill somebody, it's a bad thing, okay? It breeds more resentment, it creates more problems. And you know, it always is something you would rather not have to do. You know, now certainly a drone strike that, you know, or you know, like the one that took out Anwar al-Awlaki, who was obviously plotting, you know, attacks against us, you know, is better than sending 150,000 U.S. troops into Iraq. You know, it's less of a problem, but. No, certainly, drone strikes are not going to solve the problem. This is an ideological struggle, and we have got to figure out some way to work with our friends in the Muslim world to combat this ideology that Daesh and others are spreading, and that's the only long-term solution. But I will unapologetically say, in the short term, if you have someone who is clearly planning on how to kill Americans or Westerners, we know it, we know where they are. We, I think, have an obligation to try and stop them. And regrettably, we're not in a position to go in and capture these people. And look, I'm as strong as anyone you'll find in Congress in favor of a law enforcement approach to this. You know, and Lindsey Graham would beat me to death in the newspaper, and has tried actually on a couple of occasions on this discussion, metaphorically speaking.
He sat in that chair on all four issues
yeah,
as well.
But I think we should read these people Miranda rights. I think we should arrest them and try them, and it's worked. Over 400 terrorists locked up in prison, right through the good old-fashioned criminal justice system, and one that keeps our values intact, and it's very effective. But there are times when you just can't get in there and get the person in that way, and they pose a threat. Should there be fewer drone strikes? Probably. I think there was a period of time when we came to rely on it too much. I think the president has taken a look at that. But given the threats we face in the world, I just wouldn't be being honest if I said we have to take that option completely off the table, given the threats we face. Well, thank you all very much. I do have to get back to the
Please join me in thanking Congressman